And he's going to be talking to us about beyond smart cities and why physical AI needs not only community, but community intelligence, which is a term that I think all of us are very interested in learning. What do you mean by that?
Thank you. Can I get the clicker, please? Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Precisely, I would like to focus on why physical AI needs community intelligence, but I would like to mention first that by physical AI, I would not be focusing on robotics like you heard before, but rather how AI can be embedded in physical infrastructures where these physical infrastructures can sense, think, and act. And I'll be going a little bit over the community intelligence part because that's my expertise, where I work with citizens to do large-scale environment sensing, where they deploy do-it-yourself kind of sensors and provide community intelligence. So I would like to start with what I call is a physical AI trilemma. That if you see this is a bottleneck which happens everywhere, that you can have speed and scale that gives you efficiency, but sometimes it misses legitimacy, which you can see a lot of times in smart city programs. When you try to bring the community, like the citizens, and you try to scale it up, it gives you legitimacy, but then the problem is it's slow because bringing legitimacy takes time, all the discussions and everything. And then you can have community control and speed, like doing grassroots project at a very small scale. Of course, they are quick to implement, but the scale remains a little smaller, like a neighborhood or a city. So in general, if you look at a lot of projects, they can tick usually 2 out of these 3 things. And I think the big bottleneck that we see in research here is that if you can tick all 3 of them, maybe the system will become more efficient, more legitimate, and more trustworthy. A traditional smart city approach, like probably everyone knows, like how it works is that you have sensors, you have data processing, the AI system, the smart system, they do the analysis, you have the output, and then the community response. I want to focus here on the community response because usually those are the end users, but their kind of contribution to the systems is very limited, as it has been seen in a lot of examples, and I'll give you a couple of them. So what happens in such traditional systems is that there is context loss. The data actually loses its meaning because there's no context associated with it, and a lot of decisions are made in a very abstract manner where the key stakeholders, they're not even involved. And usually what happens is trust is lost. And some of the examples which we have seen, and probably you might have heard, is one is Songdo Business District. It was made as a futuristic city in South Korea, but now it's a ghost town. And the reason was it was one of the first data-driven cities that was developed, but people didn't move in because they didn't relate to it. And also there were a lot of questions about what was happening with their data privacy, ethics, and values. Similarly, Sidewalks Labs by Google, I think that was also discussed at a very wide scale. In Canada, it was also proposed at the City of the Future. Everyone was really excited, but then people started complaining that no one knew what exactly was happening with the data. They had no control whatsoever. So with both of these examples, one thing that stands out is, in the end, it's the people who didn't accept these technological advances. So technology was there, the infrastructure was there, but what it was missing was the human touch, the human context, and that's why both of these multi-billion projects failed. And that is something which we are trying to understand in my research, like how we can bring people right to the core of these initiatives and solutions. I call these 2 problems as the first mile and the last mile problem. The first mile problem is where you have the devices, you have the infrastructure, and you do the data processing. Because the context is missing, so what happens is the output is not what you expect. The decisions are not the same. Similarly, the last mile is where you have the data, you have everything, but the trust is missing because the people are not in the process. When you have both of these challenges, a system usually fails. And like in the last example I showed you about the smart cities, both the examples had these issues one way or the other. In some of the crowdsourcing and environmental monitoring works where I've been working on, we have realized that if you do a more value-sensitive design, you bring people into the project, it makes a difference. For example, I want to show you this example where we were working in Taiwan to understand air quality. And this is in 2015, they had 77 monitoring stations. But by the end of 2024, we had over 12,000. We were able to map the entire habited part of the island. And one thing which was really interesting was it was all community driven. So there was no incentive in terms of a monetary incentive. The incentive was just that people wanted data. It was purely based on open source hardware, open source software, and open source policies. So people had all the access to the data. They had the access to all the sensors, the 3D design, all the software. So they could even develop these themselves and build this. The next part was once we scaled the system, we had enough data. How do we make sure that the data quality is important? And in the last several presentations we have heard, it's one of the big challenges. So we tried using machine learning and AI algorithms to do anomaly detection at spatio-temporal scale. But then there were also cases where people were trying to game the system. Like we had some sensors in schools where children were just going with a hot cup of coffee next to the temperature sensor, and we would see a certain spike. And that got us thinking that it's very difficult even for an algorithm because they would just see it as an outlier. But in a similar case, if there was a very separated fire incident, it could also be considered as an outlier. So we wanted to get more context related to the data, and that is where people came in. They were the ones who were giving feedback, like a rating system, like how good the sensor is based on the quality of the data it has been giving, as well as people were able to add more details, like in terms of metadata, like what's happening around the system, like connecting it with the neighboring nodes to understand if you can get a consensus within a certain area based on the sensors that were deployed. So this is how we try to understand and fix, I would say, the first mile problem, bringing in people, making sure the data had context associated with it, and the data was trustworthy. In a similar thing, we are working here with the citizens in Zurich. We are trying to understand how they can understand more about their indoor environments. And what we realized was, because we started in a bottom-up approach, and we did a co-creation activity where we explained people, specifically the ethical and the data privacy part, like how people actually deal with their data, how much control they have, and what can they do with the data. And this somehow gave us this idea that once you have people right at the beginning, not at the end, it somehow solves the last mile problem because they can be the ones who take the ownership, and they also contribute not just because we are crowdsourcing it, but rather we are co-creating a system with the people. Based on all the lessons that we learned from these initiatives, we proposed what we call value-sensitive citizen science for AI design. And it's quite an extensive one, so I would just go very quickly like what it means. So there are three key parts of that. The first one is value discovery, where you start with understanding what are the values that are associated with the system. Then is the technical translation, where you translate those values in the system. And the final is the governance one. While it probably sounds very conceptual, but it's still based on what we learned by doing these projects back in Taiwan and also in India. And we realized that the key element is the trust. And also, in a lot of cases, for example, there have been discussions about crowdsourcing weather data, crowdsourcing other sort of environmental data. I think once you make people understand the reasoning why you want this data and what they can get back from the data, I think it changes the system, because then they are not just the end users or the receivers, but rather they are the producers, and they understand that whatever data they are sharing, they'll get some sort of services in return. So what this means in general for like decentralized physical infrastructure is that we can have a infrastructure which we can scale. So it's not just about crowd sensing or something, but rather creating an infrastructure where people take ownership, it's sustainable, and also has transparent governance. We can use participatory IoT, where we can have sensors deployed in mass numbers, massive scale, and have the ground truth. So not just the data, but also context associated with the data, which gives us rich and trustworthy data that can actually lead to more systems which are more enabled, more smart, as well as allow us to build systems that allow data-informed decision-making. And just want to say that I'm not an expert in DePIN, but based on my understanding, I feel it comes right at the first spot, because scaling is definitely a challenge. And we all have seen how it can make or break a system if you can scale, if you can ensure the data quality. And I'm kind of positive that incentivization would definitely allow people to be more involved in such systems, but how we define those incentives would also be a critical challenge. And thank you for paying attention. Okay, if anyone has any questions, I think I was ahead of my time. So, yeah.
You stick 10 minutes, perfect. So, but you have questions now. Thank you so much, Sachit. It's like I don't know, third time I've seen your presentation, and I know your work at your group, super amazing. One thing I think like you tackled, obviously, the kind of the open source, but yet very participatory thing. But actually, from an architecture perspective, a lot of participatory design didn't work, even it's open source. So I wonder, like, what is your? Can you go deeper into what's the secret sauce that you think like? Build the trust. You said like trust is super important. Like how much resources you guys put into, let's say like building this trust bond with the locals, and what is actually like what actually happened? Did you like go on a campaign, or like you was at the booth all the time? Like how did you really spread the word? Because like from a lot of different angle, right? When talking about incentive and participatory, it's a tough question. And a lot of DAOs, participatory doesn't go up from votings, and like, yeah, how do you do this? Like, I mean, as much as it sounds nice that open source and then trust, but like, what do you actually do? I mean, along that line.
Yes, it's a tough question to answer, but I can just tell you. So there's a social science part which I didn't mention because I'm also from computer science background, not a social scientist. But we always do this activity we call empathy mapping, and it works very well because the first thing when we start working on these projects is we want people to put themselves in someone else's shoes to understand why would they do it, and why wouldn't you want to do it. So I know it sounds at a very high level of emotions and all, but it does work because once people start their personal stories, and this we saw in Zurich, where a lot of families, they were complaining that there's a lot of construction going on. If you see, they are breaking buildings, making new ones. So a lot of outdoor pollution goes to indoors. So even if their indoor environment is clean, they have no control on what's happening outdoors, and they have to open windows. So that was something interesting that, you know the sources, but you cannot do anything about it. And that brings everyone together, like to understand, like if there is a way, a shared vision that you can tackle a situation in a way which is more collective rather than individualistic. So that is one of the things which worked in our case. And the other thing was more about the design perspective. Like when we were designing these sensors, we took a lot of feedback from people. For example, even I know it sounds silly, but the choice of the color of the sensor affects whether they want to use it or not, because we had like this very black looking sensor and they were like, it looks so dull. So we started making colorful sensors, and for some reason they were very happy. They wanted to use it, they wanted to install it. Even the kids in the houses who were using them, they were happy about it as well. And then we just used some smileys, which will give you a visual feedback that the air quality is bad, maybe you should open windows or something. So the idea is, you need, like, from my understanding, we need to listen to what people want. Like that's one of the things. Secondly, even as an engineer, I think sometimes we have to understand that we don't know everything, especially when it comes to design, because in the end, the people who are going to use it, I think they have better ideas how they want to see things. And once we start taking these things into the design process, I think things improve. But again, it's very contextual. Maybe what I'm doing here, it won't work in London. For example, what we did in Taiwan, maybe it won't work here. So the local context, the culture, everything is important, so it has to be taken into account. And I think for scaling any system, irrespective of weather monitoring or noise monitoring, I think it's something which could be beneficial. Yeah.
One more minute. Make it short, please.
I'll make it short. Thanks for the great talk. My question is on private data, because I think air quality data is a very safe data set to collect. But let's talk about noise monitoring, which comes in the acoustic space. We also recently heard the privacy concerns about recording your voice. So how do you see that scale of trust when it comes to the type of data from public to private? And do you think there's a way to also collect private data at scale?
Yes, I think it's a good question. In our case, we only used the location data, which is also private data, but then we use some fuzzy techniques and machine learning to, make sure that it was not, easily identifiable. With noise data and personal, voice data and things, I think it falls in a category where you need to have these anonymization techniques, where you don't lose the meaning of the data, but still keeps it, like relevant and valid. I think there are a lot of methodologies that are used in, like I don't know, like in one of our research groups, and maybe Mark knows about it. Yeah. So we know someone like who has been working on creating these algorithms which you can use to anonymize these data in a way that the relevance and the quality is maintained. But I'm unsure about how you can scale it to, for example, such sensitive data like noise. So yeah, probably I'm not the right person to answer this, but it's a very relevant question because privacy and ethics is something very important, and probably you need to tick all the boxes to do that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sachit.